So, impossible drawings of Nasca. I will start with a short introduction so that the picture is complete. The Nasca geoglyphs are huge, geometrically correct images, lines, trapezoids, spirals, and drawings, applied to the surface in the desert, not far from the city of Nasca, 300 kilometers south of Lima, the capital of Peru. The age of the drawings is no longer in doubt. This is the first millennium of our era. The method of construction is quite simple. The creators cleared the upper, dark layer of rock, or marked the boundaries with piles of stones. The figures were built according to certain schemes. I have already spoken about this in detail in my previous reports. There are a huge number of hypotheses to explain this phenomenon. I will not repeat them either. I will note that in academic science, the most common opinion is that the lines act as paths for ritual processions dedicated to the cult of fertility. Regarding this hypothesis, I would like to show the following. In the center, we see a trapezoid. In the video, it is on the left. I specially filmed this group of lines because on different satellite maps, the lines in this place look different. It turned out that this happens because some lines in the trapezoid are drawn on a very steep slope and uneven terrain. It is clearly visible that the slope can only be overcome by paths that go diagonally. It is impossible to use the lines as roads in this place without special equipment. Moreover, such an arrangement of lines on extremely inconvenient terrain is not uncommon. And this shows the obvious inconsistency of the main hypothesis of the purpose of geoglyphs. In the next picture, we see the drawings of two groups of lines and drawings. It is clearly visible that some drawings, lines, and trapezoids are connected into a single combination and have a common outline. In general, there are only two schemes of combining figures into groups on the plateau, but I have already talked about this, so let's move on. In my opinion, there are some very popular misconceptions related to the Nasca geoglyphs. First, you can often hear the opinion that there was not enough population in this region to mark, draw, and clear such a number of geoglyphs. Indeed, the river valleys where the Nasca culture existed are not capable of feeding a large number of people. But it must be said that people lived relatively comfortably. The climate was favorable. They ate, judging by the remains of their teeth. Normally, and building geoglyphs is not the most difficult task. There are places where this is really difficult, but there are not many of them, and it should be taken into account that pilgrims from the most remote areas flocked to Kawachi, the ceremonial center of the Nasca culture, who could also take part in the construction. The second common misconception is that the construction of ideal straight lines of kilometers long, as we see on satellite maps, required special equipment that was unavailable to the ancients. Some time ago, I was concerned with the problem. Is there an effective way to draw long straight lines without special equipment and without involving a large number of assistants? It turns out that everything is simple. You can do such things without any help and practically in real time. The scheme is as follows. A reference point is set, which is clearly visible from afar. For the ancients, this could be a fire, which is visible for many kilometers at night. In my case, it was a stick with a beer can on it. The terrain allowed me to draw a trapezoid 130 meters long. You take a stick in your hand, which is convenient for drawing a line in the sand. The same can be done on the surface of the Nasca Desert. You stand at the starting point and go in the direction of the reference point. We make a sketch with a stick, which in this case was outlined with a wider paddle for greater visibility and correction of inaccuracies. The line is not perfect when viewed from the ground. However, all the lines in Nasca look similar. And from above, all the inaccuracies are smoothed out. And, as we can see, we got a completely normal, medium-sized trapezoid, which in Nasca would be indistinguishable from others. And if the people who are relaxing nearby would help in clearing this figure, the resemblance would be complete. The outline itself took about an hour and a half. And if the site allowed, the figure could have been made much larger. But two things should be noted. First, it is necessary to concentrate very carefully on the reference point to which you need to go. Literally, you need to clear yourself of all thoughts. Any extraneous thought disrupts the direction of movement, and the line begins to curve. This is practically an exercise in meditation, or something like shamanic practice. And here is another important thing. Any significant unevenness in the relief requires assistance and more careful marking. But in general, there is nothing fantastic about this. And in this way, it is really possible to draw thousands of trapezoids and lines that we see on satellite maps. On my next trip to Peru, I'm going to draw a line 2 to 3 kilometers long in a section of the desert free of archaeological sites. But there are, in my opinion, some really interesting and intriguing mysteries that are critical to understanding the meaning and purpose of these amazing figures. The main one, perhaps, is that the geoglyphs were created for an observer who is located above, at a low altitude. Every trip to the desert, every drone flight convinces me of this more and more. It is difficult to talk about this because no artifacts have been found that indicate that the ancient builders knew how to rise into the air. What indicates this unusual property of geoglyphs? I have already spoken about this a lot in my reports, and now I will repeat it briefly. Firstly, this is that from the surface of the Earth, the lines or boundaries of the trapezoids look extremely sloppy. Yes, the line stretches for a long distance, goes almost beyond the horizon, but what you see in front of you is a very sloppy site. The question arises, how is the quality of construction controlled? How did the builders on the ground understand where the line was made satisfactorily and looks good from above, and where corrections were needed? Secondly, these are construction methods. The most obvious and natural method of construction is when the dark layer of the surface was removed and the light soil was exposed. This is how most of the work was done. But a significant part of the geoglyphs were made of piles of stones located at a considerable distance from each other. Why this way, and not a more natural and visual way, laying out a row of stones that look good and beautiful from the surface? In the video, we see an example of this type of construction. If these are fertility cults, roads for ritual walking, a row of stones on the border would be more visual and obvious, as they did in ancient times, as they do now. Why piles located at a distance of 3, 5, 10 meters from each other, like signal lights at airfields? I have not seen a single geoglyph made of rows of stones laid out on the ground. Drone flights helped find a possible solution. A pile of stones, even when the sun is at its zenith, creates an internal shadow and is clearly visible from a sufficient height and looks like a contrasting mark. But a row of stones is no longer visible even from a small height. And if it is slightly covered with sand, the border can only be seen from the surface. And another very important detail. The builders very carefully aligned the outlines of the geoglyphs on the uneven terrain, which obviously took a significant amount of time. This is clearly visible from above, and in many cases is completely unnoticeable from the ground. It is worth mentioning the principle of anamorphosis here. In simple terms, this is when an image is distorted in such a way that it can only be seen from a certain point. Nowadays, this type of street art can be seen in cities, when similar images of three-dimensional objects are painted on the asphalt, visible only from one angle. Once I noticed a similar effect when I was looking at a large trapezoid from a height. The diverging boundaries became parallel, and the trapezoid turned into a rectangular platform, or a road. Moreover, a funny visual effect occurs. If you look at this road, the space seems to shrink, but if you look to the side or at the mountains on the horizon, the space returns to its true size. Calculating the height from which such an effect occurs is a simple school geometry problem. And when the drone rises to this height, you can always see this visual effect. And I will note one more thing. All these trapezoids look very sloppy from the ground. But it is from this height that the trapezoid looks more straightforward and clear, and most likely it was from this point that the construction was controlled. In the video, there is a good example of this, a geoglyph in the area of the village of Santa Cruz, the largest of the trapezoids, which unfortunately was heavily damaged by the Dakar rally in 2006. We are above the narrow part and can see a giant 1.5-kilometer trapezoid in the form of a huge road with parallel borders. And here we come to the main part, the Nasca drawings. So, the drawings. On the screen are images, one way or another connected with the Nasca culture. The top row, petroglyphs found in the territory of the Nasca culture, but made several thousand years before its appearance. The middle row, small geoglyphs, 5 to 10 meters, located on the slopes of hills in this region. The bottom, examples of iconography, images on textiles and ceramics belonging to the Nasca culture and the preceding Paracas culture. Note the similar style of the images, generally no different from the images of many other primitive cultures. The video shows a large number of primitive geoglyphs located in the Nasca and Palpa area. There are a huge number of them there. Nowadays, such drawings are usually presented as sensations, and researchers still have a lot of such sensations in stock. Moreover, artificial intelligence is engaged in their search and completion, and restorers reproduce them on the slopes of hills as bait for tourists. I will talk about a completely different type of Nasca drawings. The video clearly shows a completely different style and approach to the structure of the image. They are drawn in a single line, have very elegant contours, thoughtful and well-executed geometry. They have quite a lot of verified curves, reminiscent of Bezier curves, often used in computer editors. They are drawn on a flat surface of the desert and are impossible to see without rising above them to a significant height. And finally, they are huge. The smallest is 45 meters, the largest is more than 300. Almost all known drawings of this type are shown in this image. Although not to scale, the relative sizes are not preserved. This is done in order to appreciate their unique style, reminiscent of modern design, in contrast to the primitive style in the iconography of the Nasca culture. The following picture gives an idea of their relative sizes. In the center left is a small spot. This is one of the primitive geoglyphs located on the slopes of the hills that I mentioned earlier, and which are presented as the latest discoveries. Any of us can draw such drawings, and it can be corrected by moving away a little. Why I was so interested in these drawings? I found a publication that said that a certain Joe Nickel, an employee of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, tried to reproduce one of the Nasca drawings in life size. This is the famous condor drawing, which is 120 meters long. I will not go into details of the experiment. We can see its result in the picture on the left. For comparison, the original drawing is in the center. For an inexperienced viewer, this experiment can be considered successful. Overall, everything is very similar. But if you look closely at the details, there are differences and they are very significant. Some proportions are lost. There are deviations from the axial lines. Graceful curves are not drawn, which overall makes the image on the left a more imperfect drawing than the original. And if I, say, were the customer of a logo with a similar drawing, I would choose the middle drawing or ask to bring the left image to perfection. And accordingly, the question arises, if the ancient builders saw all these subtleties, strictly observed them, Then how did they do all this? What did the ancients have before their eyes when they transferred the drawing to the desert? Was it a sketch, a drawing, or something else? The famous German researcher Maria Reich, who spent almost her entire adult life in the Nasca desert and studied geoglyphs, saw all these fine details in the drawings well, and spent a lot of time trying to figure out the methods of drawing these drawings in the desert. She paid special attention to how the ancients managed to build graceful curves, which, obviously, are impossible to do without preliminary calculations. All this also interested me, and I suggest taking a closer look at the famous image spider. At first glance, this is a very simple image, nothing outstanding here. But in fact, this is not so. It is similar to how to draw a perfect circle. With a compass, you can do this in a few seconds. But try to draw a perfect circle by hand and see how long it takes. Here is the same thing. In this image, we tried to find symmetry, but as you can clearly see, the original image is more interesting and livelier. And here are attempts by artists to draw a similar spider by hand. But, as in the case of the perfect circle, the hand-drawn figures are very far from perfect and look like primitive images. The spider's legs have identical, correct curves, which are almost impossible to depict without careful drawing or without a graphics editor. And we must not forget that this is a large image applied to the surface of the desert. If we look at the drawings on the ceramics of the Nasca culture, we see that all the images were drawn from certain parts, just like children draw the body, draw the arms, legs, head, and so on. There is nothing like that on the huge drawings in the desert. And in order not to be unfounded, I decided to check, maybe there really is nothing complicated in drawing such large drawings. And in the desert area, we tried to draw in the style of Nasca drawings the logo of one of the TV companies, which at that time was the sponsor of our work. The image was not the largest, 40 by 60 meters, which corresponds to the smallest Nasca drawings. And so, with the help of 3 Indians, one of whom had previously made a small project in a graphics editor, we applied this symbol to the surface of the earth. Then a drone was raised to check the quality of the image. It was clear that many curves did not work out the first time. Then we corrected the errors, and already on the next rise of the drone, we saw a more or less acceptable image. But it must be said that we never achieved the elegance of the ancient drawings. The next attempt was to reproduce the famous hummingbird, also a small image, about 60 meters long, on the surface of a frozen lake. Here, too, with the help of 2 Indian assistants, we first made markings, and having a similar project in hand, the contours were applied. But this image is more complex, and therefore there were mistakes from the very beginning, since it is very difficult to draw an image practically blindly when sometimes you do not understand what part of this drawing you are on. From above, our mistakes and inaccuracies became very clearly visible. It was clear that the first time again, we would not get an acceptable result. The snow was very loose, and sometimes fishermen interfered, who decided to find out what kind of fishing method we practiced here, and how many we had already caught. We had to wait a few days, and after the snow fell, we decided to update the image and correct the inaccuracies. And again, only the second time we got a satisfactory result, almost completely corresponding to the original. But if you look closely, the elegance of the ancient drawing could not be achieved here either. And of course the question arises, how did the ancients do all this? They need practice, they need a project, they need writing and arithmetic skills, the ability to build right angles. They need to finally rise into the air to check the quality. Where are the fields on which the ancients trained? Where are the carriers on which you can make a project? How to monitor the quality? Why such thoroughness? There are no hills or other elevations near any of the drawings, climbing which you can appreciate the skill of the ancient builders. Now we will try to look at the drawings separately, paying attention to different features. Unfortunately, there will be some confusion because there are many drawings, they are different, and it is not possible to combine them into clear categories. Let's start with this unusual image. This is also a Nasca geoglyph, and it is located in the very center of the Nasca plateau. It is shown from an airplane. It is not very clearly visible, and I took a photo from the museum, taken at a good time. The image is 60 meters long, and it is different from the drawing shown earlier. The image obviously belongs to the Paracas culture, which preceded the Nasca culture. And we see that it is also made with greater taste and elegance compared to similar examples on Paracas textiles. What is also unusual is that it is the only one of its kind. There is nothing else like it. On the next slide, we see the correspondence of the subjects of the iconography of the Nasca culture and the giant drawings in the desert. A hummingbird in the upper part of the slide, and a creature resembling a crayfish in the lower part. On the next slide, there are different versions of a hummingbird and a parrot, as they were depicted on ceramics and textiles. There is also an image of a killer whale, which repeats the ceramic figurine in detail. That is, we clearly see the same images but made in different quality. The image of the monkey is interesting. You can see that in the drawing in the desert, the hand seems to grow from the head, which emphasizes the volume of the figure and is completely natural for us. But on the ceramics, we see a more primitive approach to the image. Moreover, the huge drawing in proportions and dynamics more closely corresponds to a living monkey, which was most likely depicted. Next is the spider we are already familiar with. What is interesting is that this is not quite a spider. Spiders have a slightly different body structure. This creature resembles an ant. But it is not an ant because an ant has 6 legs and the ancient drawing has 8. In the right lower leg, we see an appendage, and very often the drawing in the desert is compared to a small Brazilian spider, whose sexual organ is also in the right lower leg. But for some reason, no one sees that this is, in fact, a fantastic creature. And the appendage on the paw only says that the spider is part of a larger group of geoglyphs, as we have already seen in the example of the monkey. The next 2 drawings resemble the cassava plant, very popular in Nasca. What is interesting here? They drew it as if according to the same scheme. Both plants have the same branching. On each side, there are 3 branches, with a slight variation in the right drawing. That is, they drew the same plant but in different styles, and also with great grace and art. The next slide is perhaps the most interesting but little-known image in the desert. Why it is not noticed by both guides and academic scientists is a mystery to me. This drawing, or rather a group of drawings, is the largest image in the desert. The total length is about 400 meters. I find it difficult to say how one can make a well-calibrated curve 300 meters long. Even with a coordinate grid, there will be problems here. Here is a drawing of this figure. It most likely depicts a frigate bird, which is found in this region. The drawing contains certain oddities. All the details are spread out, but at the same time, there is integrity of the image. And if we look at the eye area, the details of the beak will fall out of our attention. If we move it further away so that all the details are included in the area of our attention, then the details, due to their very small size, will become completely indistinguishable. The assumption arises that the image was not made for human perception. Even from an airplane that flies at the altitude from which the other figures are clearly visible, this drawing cannot be seen in its entirety, and the airplane flies along it for some time. On this slide, I have collected all the largest drawings compared to a standard 100-meter football field. And once again, I will note this gigantic verified curve at the frigate, which can be easily obtained in a graphic editor. And if an artist with good skills can do this on a sheet of paper, then how to transfer it to the desert on such an area without a project and special devices is still unclear to me. This drawing is also interesting because there is a whole group of figures connected to each other. If the rightmost outline, resembling a little man, is very damaged and it is difficult to say anything here, Then the smaller bird is clearly connected to the large frigate and fits very harmoniously into the group of drawings. The builders not only had a good idea of the location of each element, that is, they had a carefully planned project, but also monitored the aesthetic quality of the image, as if trying to please some viewers who would contemplate it from above. It should be noted that they did it flawlessly. This is not the only group of drawings. Next to the observation tower on the Pan American Highway, there is such a wonderful group of drawings. A huge trapezoid turns into a zigzag, which in turn ends with a drawing of a tree. And all this is done in a single contour. The total length of the line is 5 kilometers. You can see that next to the tree there are 2 more drawings, which, obviously, are also part of this group, which makes it quite harmonious and complete. Among the drawings, there are images that have no analogs in the iconography of the Nasca culture. For example, this image, and here perhaps a bird in the style of Cubism. There is such a hook, there are such drawings reminiscent of magical symbols. There are very intricate spirals. I'd like to draw attention to this drawing. It was found by Japanese researchers in the 80s. They published a tiny photograph, and nothing more was known about this image. The car tracks helped find the location of this drawing, and it was photographed in detail. This is a very interesting image. Small, about 60 meters long, but very elegant and intricate. If this were the only drawing, one could think about the technological method of drawing this figure. Its outline is smooth depressions in the ground, with smooth edges, as if pressed by something round. Ideal repeating roundings. Moreover, the drawing is applied to a very uneven relief. Here is a drawing of this image. It is unknown what it is. Either a stylized image of a person or some internal organs, but everything is done, as we can see, with special care. Once again, I would like to draw attention to the verified curved lines, which are extremely difficult to draw by hand. Upon closer inspection of the drawings, one can notice that some images are asymmetrical. The condor on the right is drawn as if in 2 planes located at an angle to each other. The pelican is made in a similar way. The spider has a more complex asymmetry. The planes of the body and legs have different degrees of curvature. And if you compare spider number 1, which has real proportions, with number 2, where the asymmetry is removed, you can notice that the first image is more alive, more interesting than the second. And this is not a unique feature of these particular drawings. Many images have signs of projections of 3-dimensional figures. For example, a tree could be depicted traditionally with irregular branches and leaves. Ancient builders took a more sophisticated path. Imagine that you are cutting out a figure from paper with straight branches. Then each branch is bent in 5 places, and as a result we get a tree that is visible from an airplane. What meaning the ancients put into this method of depiction is unknown. The most indicative drawing in this regard is probably the figure with the generally accepted name 9 fingers. Here we will not discuss what prompted the ancients to draw such a very strange 60-meter figure in the desert. But the emphasis on the 3-dimensionality of the image is expressed here most clearly. I made a simplified plasticine model of this object, which, by the way, turned out to be balanced and could immediately stand on its feet. Then a computer animation was made for greater clarity. An interesting abstract drawing, as I call it, 3-horned dog, which also has signs of a projection of a 3-dimensional object. This is indicated by the small left front paw, which grows practically from the head, which is not typical for primitive drawings. And we see that this creature is slightly turned towards us. We can return to the image of the pelican. The tilt of the tail, the relative sizes of the paws, the way the feathers and the wings are depicted all indicate that the plane in which the right part of the image is drawn is close to horizontal, and the lower part of the drawing is closer to us. Perhaps we can stop here. I will add the following. Even if you have a flawless, detailed project plotted on a coordinate grid, it is extremely difficult to transfer a large-scale drawing to the desert surface without errors. Moreover, the enlargement must be hundreds of times. This is further complicated by the fact that the drawings do not consist of numerous details, but are made with a single line. Let me note once again that after transferring the drawing to the surface and increasing its size, there should be imperfections and errors. But there are none, and there are no traces of their correction. And it is impossible to write this off as random coincidences. In Peru, there are many geoglyphs of a fairly large size, applied to the slopes of hills and clearly visible both from the ground and on satellite maps. It is clear that they were made according to detailed projects using modern devices used in geodesy. But almost all of them have similar imperfections, distortions, which I mentioned earlier. This is not the case here. The Nasca drawings have a lightness, a certain courage, like you drew it like this, and I will draw it even bigger and more beautifully. The big problem is the complete absence of sketches and projects. Maria Reich pointed to something similar to sketches that she found near the geoglyphs, but there are no photos or any other materials confirming this. And what exactly was discussed is unclear. There was nothing like that near the drawings that we managed to visit. Now there are many videos and photos in high resolution, and nowhere do we see any sketches, corrections, or marks for the coordinate grid. Moreover, on the so-called Australis, which I have talked about a lot, the corrections and base points are clearly visible and even marked. There is nothing like that on the Nasca drawings. And it is worth remembering the main problem: control and view from above. If you build such images correctly and beautifully, this is one thing. It is quite another to build them so that no one can see and appreciate them. There is a false opinion that the drawings are visible from the surrounding mountains. This is not true. Anyone who has been there knows that there is a large distance from the drawings to the nearest foothills, and there can be no talk of any views from the mountains. I know one drawing that is located near the foothills, but the angle of view and the distance do not allow you to understand not only what is drawn, but also to see the drawing itself among other lines. Next, I would like to dwell on the following significant point. This is the obvious connection of the drawings with the Nasca culture. On the map, the white spot is the location of the main settlements of the Nasca culture. The gray spot around is the region of influence of the Nasca culture. The shaded areas are the locations where the geoglyphs are located. Some experts believe that the Nasca culture was not quite ordinary. People could only settle in river valleys and small settlements. Between the valleys, there was a lifeless desert for tens of kilometers. But nevertheless, instead of disparate tribes fighting among themselves, a society was born here, united by common cultural, religious, and social traditions, which existed for more than 1,000 years. The slide shows reconstructions of typical dwellings of that time. People lived in small farmsteads, villages. The population was small, according to various estimates from 8,000 to 20,000 people. Judging by the remains, people lived in prosperity with enough food. There are no traces of combat wounds on the skeletons. That is, they lived without wars. The ancient Nasca people had remarkable cultural traditions. This is a unique and well-recognizable polychrome ceramics, which was made using fairly complex technologies. Also textiles, the manufacture of which is considered one of the most perfect in ancient Peru. At the top, right, we see a reconstruction of the appearance of representatives of the culture. When talking about the Nasca culture, it is impossible not to mention Kawachi, a huge ritual center of about 20 square kilometers, consisting of buildings resembling pyramids and terraces. Some time ago, these buildings were considered the capital of the Nasca culture, but then it turned out that this place was not inhabited. It had a purely ritual and ceremonial purpose. The structure is not quite ordinary. There is nothing that resembles an altar or anything similar, which is typical for ritual structures. Kawachi is a large number of isolated buildings connected by corridors, stairs, passages. These buildings had adobe walls, sometimes very high, columns, wooden posts, ceilings. All this was often rebuilt, reconstructed. This center was of great importance. It was visited by a large number of pilgrims, sometimes from very remote regions. There are traces of a large earthquake and strong floods. In 400 AD, changes occurred in the life of the Nasca culture. Kawachi was deliberately burned and covered, and later used as a cemetery. A huge number of different kinds of artifacts were found in Kawachi: ceramics, textiles, amulets, musical instruments. The picture shows a large number of ceramic antlers, intentionally broken and buried in a crack left by an earthquake. The musical culture of Nasca deserves special mention. The music of the Nasca people was very developed. At first, I did not attach much importance to this. For example, how can you tune clay antlers? It turns out they knew how to do it. Antares were made using special technologies. There were 2- and 3-chambered antlers, which had a very specific sound. There were very clear musical modes by which these instruments were tuned. They knew how to tune them very accurately, taking into account the shrinkage of clay during firing. The music, as researchers write, was dissonant and very unusual to our ears and had 14 tones, unlike our modern 12-tone. There are many strange images associated with musicians. That is, the Nasca culture, and now you can hear the phrase Nasca civilization, existed in favorable conditions. The visual culture was developed, music, there was prosperity. There were also no problems with water, which in a certain season left the rivers. The ancients knew how to build so-called filtration galleries, pukios. These are multi-kilometer tunnels to water sources, equipped with wells, and bringing water out. There are dozens of these pukios, some of them are still working today. What else is interesting? One of the main characters in the iconography of Nasca was a flying creature. The top row is images of the Paracas culture, the predecessor of the Nasca culture. The creature, judging by the position of the body, the fluttering hair, emotions, is clearly in a state of flight. A large number of variations on the theme of flight can be seen in the Nasca culture. Whether this is related to myths, legends, or something else is unknown. But it is certain that flight was given a special place in the Nasca culture. And let's try to draw some conclusions. We see 2 groups of drawings, made in different styles with different levels of skill and labor costs. Moreover, there is practically no smooth transition between them. It is necessary to take into account the following important detail. Most of the drawings on ceramics and textiles are anthropomorphic, human-like images. That is, in these images people are presented in the form of animals, fish, mystical creatures, which is completely natural for any primitive culture. And one more thing concerning the Nasca culture. The so-called cult of trophy heads was widespread there. And it is difficult to call them trophies. It was a peaceful culture, and there are no traces of military interactions with neighbors there. Now you can hear more and more the name cult of sacrificial heads. In the drawings, we see them in great abundance. On these heads, they sewed up the lips and eyes, made a hole between the eyes, where a rope was inserted, presumably for wearing. Archaeologists find them in large quantities at the sites of ancient settlements. There are figures that up to 20% of the local population underwent this procedure. What kind of cult it was, what meaning it had, is unknown, but the fact that it was of great importance in the life of this people is obvious. But among the giant images, there are no anthropomorphic images or severed heads. That is, we can say that the authors of the huge drawings, although they belonged to the Nasca culture, at least had a different worldview. They were not at all interested in what the common people lived by, although without the help of this population, without workers, the application of such a number of geometric figures is impossible. If the common people participated in the creation of numerous lines and trapezoids, then this was done blindly. There is not a single hint in the iconography of the creation of such figures. Although, according to archaeologists, the construction of geoglyphs was one of the central tasks of the Nasca society. So, we see two groups of people belonging to the Nasca culture. The first group is the common population, who were engaged in everyday life, agriculture, hunting, painted terrible gods on ceramics, followed the cult of sacrificial heads, and so on. But there was another group with a different worldview, motivation, and lifestyle. It was most likely a small and influential group in society, which could be called clergy, priests, shamans. But here the situation is somewhat different. Among the burials, there are no elite graves that indicate the status of a person, his or her financial situation. These people had access to image control from the air from a great height. But no hints of devices that would allow one to rise into the air were found among the Nasca culture. But, as we see, it was absolutely necessary for the construction of such images. It turns out that here we must talk about flight, use completely unscientific concepts such as levitation, out-of-body experience, and the like. That is, to say that these people, or beings, as you like, possess supernatural abilities. This is incredible, but as one famous literary character said, if you discard everything impossible, what remains, even the most incredible, will be the answer. It is possible that a completely natural explanation will be found for the geoglyphs. But the longer I study this problem, the more I see the illogicality and impossibility of what is happening. And if we assume the completely unbelievable, then we can say the following. It is possible that some people from the Nasca society, using strange, sophisticated, and in some ways very dangerous, if we recall the sacrificial heads, methods, tried to make a small step in human evolution and go beyond human capabilities. The trapezoids and lines are part of a complex process, and the giant drawings are a kind of confirmation of the result, the achievement of these incredible qualities. If this is so, then the essence of the process is irretrievably lost to us with the disappearance of the Nasca culture, and the phenomenon of giant geoglyphs will remain inexplicable.